Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for February through March. Over the last 2 weeks, we've seen precipitation move across the Great Basin and storm systems basically move from northwest to southeast across the region. Most areas have only seen light amounts of precipitation or below normal precipitation, but we have seen some above normal precipitation in the far southern areas of the Great Basin and also even over parts of northern Nevada into southern Idaho. Over the last 30 days, we've seen temperatures generally warmer than average across the Great Basin, especially recently, where we did see some temperatures well above normal and even near or at records for the last week in January before storms started moving back in. Precipitation, again, you can see for the last 30 days, a little bit more than what we saw in the last 2 weeks. And again, that above normal precipitation anywhere from central and northern Nevada into southwest Idaho, and then over parts of southern Utah. But still around the periphery of the Great Basin is where we've seen below normal precipitation in the Sierra and also in the higher terrain of central Idaho into Wyoming and parts of Utah. Our precipitation since the beginning of the water year, October 1st, 2023, you can see the only areas that are really near or even just a hair above normal are northern Nevada into southwest and parts of southern Idaho. Otherwise, our precipitation is well below normal in most areas of the Great Basin. Currently, our snowpack, again, in Nevada is where we've seen the bulk of the precipitation with some of these storms. Snowpack is near normal, otherwise well below normal and below 50% in the Sierra, and then still below normal over parts of northern and central Idaho down into Wyoming. Not so much into Utah, but the higher terrain of Utah, the northern Wasatch, the Uintas, are still doing fairly well. Definitely some storms recently in January have kept that snowpack near about average. Looking at our fuel moisture really is in a state of dormancy, so again, really no issues with dry conditions. We have had enough storm systems move through, along with some cooler temperatures and higher humidity to mitigate any fire concerns at this time. We do still have some areas that have above normal fine fuel growth from the last year or two in parts of southern Idaho and northern Nevada, so those areas could see an uptick in fire activity if we see prolonged dry conditions followed by a wind event, which again, we just have not seen those conditions yet. Our soil moisture as of the end of January is very high over many areas of the Great Basin. Some exceptions are parts of western Nevada into the Sierra and parts of Utah and the Arizona Strip. Looking at our drought conditions, we have had some changes in drought. Most of the Great Basin still remains with no drought conditions. Still, eastern Utah, parts of the Arizona Strip, and down into Arizona have those abnormally dry or moderate drought conditions that have been the case really for some time. However, further north, we are seeing some drought start to emerge over parts of northern and now into central Idaho. So those areas is what we'll be watching here going forward. We really don't anticipate a big snow year for Idaho at this time, going through the rest of the winter and the spring. So as you can see from the image on the right, we are looking for some drought development up into Idaho. Otherwise, we will likely see improvements to the drought over parts of Utah and far southern areas of the Great Basin, as we will have some storm systems moving through here throughout February and probably lingering into the spring. Looking at our drought time series, which takes us over the last 20 years or so, you can see the year 2000 on the far left and the year 2024 on the far right. From this, it's easy to see our cyclical pattern of drought where we see significant drought last for several years, and then we see precipitation move through and mitigate the drought concerns, and then the drought returns. And again, that cycle is fairly routine, but you can see where we are in the drought cycle right now is where we're coming out of drought. Again, most areas, like we just saw, are free of drought across the Great Basin. And these black boxes showing generally our lower elevations show where our fire seasons are larger, where we burn the most acreage. And you can see we are entering into that time period yet again. So that'll be something we'll be watching going into the fire season, is the precipitation, obviously, for the rest of the winter and the spring. The potential for any new growth with our really soils that are primed for fine fuel growth with lack of drought. And then we'll see what our weather is during the fire season, because all of that will tie together to determine what the fire season will be like. But the potential will certainly be there for some of our lower elevations with our fine fuels to have some pretty decent acreage burn. So again, that'll be something we'll be watching going into the fire season. So kind of putting everything together, we already saw sort of what's been going on, so now we'll look at what's currently happening and what we expect in the future. So with El Nino and La Nina, we have been in a state of El Nino, which is where the sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific are warmer than average. So you can see these points here on the left. These are our current conditions. So obviously you can see we're well into the red, the warmer sea surface temperatures. But you can see from all of these lines, which are different models, depicting basically the same trend. We are still going to remain in this El Nino going through the beginning of the year. And then as we get closer to spring and fire season, we do expect those water temperatures to cool, pushing us back into probably neutral conditions for much of the fire season, but possibly a return of La Nina late in the fire season going into later this year. So we'll talk about how that influences our weather going forward. So first, we have been in a state of El Nino. So these are the typical weather patterns when we are in an El Nino winter. And again, we typically see the most influence from El Nino during the winter months. We typically see wetter and cooler conditions down over southern areas of the Great Basin, including Southern California and the Southwest, and typically warmer and somewhat drier conditions over northern areas of the Great Basin. Now, we haven't really seen those conditions emerge in the winter so far. We do have some other atmospheric conditions that are really taking away from the impacts of El Nino, so we haven't really seen those true impacts yet. We are starting to turn the page on that, and going into February, we will see some of our more traditional impacts from El Nino. But again, due to some other atmospheric factors taking away from it, we likely won't see a very strong precipitation signature with this El Nino, and likely won't be very long lasting, at least, or persistent in the same areas. So again, we will see some of these conditions, but probably not the high impacts we've seen from some other El Nino years. So going forward through the first week of February, again, as I mentioned, we are expecting that pattern change where our storm system dives further south, really impacting California, southern areas of the Great Basin, and the Southwest. So you can see this is the precipitation total over the next 7 or 8 days that's forecast. And you can see very heavy precipitation in California, but also heavier precipitation in southern Nevada and southern Utah, as opposed to areas further north. So again, this would be a little bit more of a classic signature of El Nino. But we are still seeing some precipitation up north as well, up into Idaho. So really, all areas of the Great Basin and much of the West are going to be seeing some precipitation here over the beginning part of February. The 8 to 14 day outlook, taking us into the middle of February, still shows that pattern kind of sticking around for the first half of the month, so the first 2 weeks. Cooler and wetter conditions, especially over the southern half of the Great Basin. And then looking forward over the next 4 months, again, February will likely see that certainly the first half or first 2 to 3 weeks of the month, those wetter and cooler conditions down south, and somewhat warmer, somewhat drier, but still seeing some precipitation up north. As we move into March, we might start to lose some of this precipitation signature in the south, but still pointing to at least normal conditions over southern areas, and then a little bit drier over the northern tier. And then going into maybe later in April and May is where we may see that pattern shift again, bringing that storm track a little bit further north, maybe some wetter conditions up north, and drying in the far southern area. So really what this means for our fire season going forward is we're probably not going to see a huge impact to our snowpack up in the far north, just with this continuing, still indicating somewhat of a drier trend. So I would say places like Idaho, Wyoming may end the winter with a below normal snowpack. The Sierra could be kind of near normal or closer to normal depending on what happens here over the next couple of months, because we have a long way to go since our snowpack is so far below normal. But I do expect that to really turn the page in February. And then going towards the end of the fire season, really much of the northern half of the Great Basin might end up with a below normal snowpack. So that could open the door to the higher elevations drying out, at least on a normal time frame, or maybe even a little bit earlier, depending on the amount of snow we have left come April and early May. So that'll be something to watch heading into July and August. But also southern areas, depending on the amount of precipitation we get, we will be watching that fine field growth. And if we see those drier, warmer conditions emerge in May in the south, that could push us really quick into fire season in the south, which timing-wise would be about normal, but depending on the amount of fine fuel growth we have, could be looking at maybe some above normal. So a lot of flies in the ointment here, a lot of things to watch though in the coming months going into the fire season, because we certainly have probably more of a likelihood of a very active fire season as opposed to a very slow one. So again, we'll be watching those factors really closely as we get towards April, May, and June. So putting everything together right now, it's still normal conditions, normal fire potential. Obviously, February, March, April is really out of season for much of the Great Basin, so our normal is really low fire activity. As we get towards later in April and May, we don't have any areas of above normal yet. That will be largely determined by the amount of fine fuel we have, and certainly in the May time period, the only areas that we would be looking at for above normal will likely be the southern half of the Great Basin. But that will be something to continue to monitor. And again, really we'll be looking towards those fine fuel loading values as we go towards the fire season. So anyone who measures and reports those will be looking at getting a lot of that data towards the beginning of the fire season. So that concludes the seasonal outlook for this month. Stay tuned and we will give you an update at the beginning of March.